Pastor John from H2O Church, coming to you from my bedroom. Actually, I have been banished here. It is not because I am sick, it is simply because my family needs the rest of the house. So we are trying to take advantage of this time and go deeper in dealing with our stress and anxiety and walking with God. And I don't know how many of you caught yesterday's Facebook Live, but I talked about Psalm 3 and how to take our emotions and go to God with them. And the Psalms really are unique. It's a unique section of the Bible because it teaches us how to do that. So, David, just a very short history of David, is that David was a man of God who went through some horribly difficult circumstances, and he had a king that was chasing him in the wilderness for much of his life. And so he cried out to God time and time again, and that's why we have the Psalms. So you'll want to pull out a piece of paper or something to take notes on because, again, we're not an acronym type church, but there is an acronym here that will be helpful to you. So if you have that, and if you have a Bible, open up to Psalm 27. It's what we're going to look at today. And I'll give you the acronym, first of all, PSALM, which spells Psalm. And the P stands for the psalmist. And the S is the situation. A is what does he ask or assert? L is the question, what does this say about the Lord? And then M, what does this say about me? All right, everybody ready? You'll notice the XOs on my coffee mug. Feeling the love today. So it's good when you're looking at the Psalms to start with the situation. And sometimes there's what's called a superscription, which is a little description right at the top of the Psalm. Psalm 3 has that. Psalm 27 just says a Psalm of David, which is not a lot of information. But the way to glean this is to look through the Psalm and just see, are there any clues to the situation that he is in? And here, as you look at verse 2, when evildoers assail me to eat up my flesh, my adversaries and foes, it is they who stumble and fall. Though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war arise against me, yet I will be confident. And so you can see that there's a situation here. There is an army that is opposing David at this point. They're encamped against him. And so that's just a little clue. If you look over at verse 10, my father and my mother have forsaken me, but the Lord will take me in. There is a time in David's life when an army of King Saul was this wicked, crazy king that was chasing him. And there was a time when they were chasing him that people needed to line up either with David or with Saul, and there was slander being spread about David, and people needed to choose who they were with. And that's probably what is going on here. And then in verse 12, verse 12 says, give me not up to the will of my adversaries, for false witnesses have risen against me, and they breathe out violence. And we're going to come back to that there. But those are little clues to the situation. People are speaking against David, so imagine what that would feel like. He has people opposing him. There's a very real threat to his life. So maybe that's a stretch to the coronavirus and all that we're experiencing, but those are his circumstances. So as we look at P, the psalmist, what is the psalmist feeling is the question we're going to ask. And again, I encourage you to write these notes down. We don't have time to read through this whole psalm. It's 14 verses long. But in verse 1, the Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear? Whenever you see that, even if it says that they're not feeling fear, they are battling fear. And so I would write down he's feeling or battling fear. Verse 3 Though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war shall arise against me, yet I shall be confident. And so he's feeling confident. He's feeling determined. Verse 4, one thing I've asked from the Lord, that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. And so, I don't know, what do you call that? What feeling is that? Is that longing? Is that clarity? Is that desire? It's one of those things. Verse 5, he will hide me. God will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will lift me high upon a rock. Verse 6, and now my head shall be lifted up above my enemies all around me, and I will offer in his tent sacrifices with shouts of joy. And what he's experiencing is trust and joy. So this is how the Psalms help me. They help me to see the wide range of feelings that David has, and that enables me to experience and express those things back to God myself. If you look at verse 8, you can write down longing or clarity. Verse 9 is fear or insecurity. Verse 10, he feels forsaken or abandoned. Verse 12, I want to go back to this. Give me not up to the will of my adversaries, for false witnesses have risen against me, and they breathe out violence. So if there's someone standing up against you and saying things about you, think about how you'd feel. You'd probably feel out of control. You'd probably feel helpless. And so even though we're not in the same situation, the same circumstances that David was in, what we can relate to is the feelings that he was experiencing. Many of us do feel out of control or helpless in our situation. And then verse 14, wait for the Lord, be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. What feeling would you attach to that? David is feeling hope. So we've looked at his situation, we've asked what he's feeling, and we can recognize now that he has journeyed from fear to hope. So you may not know this, but most of these psalms were put to music and they were sung. And so regardless, we can use this as we relate to God in prayer, and we can pray back these very same words. So we've looked at the situation. We've looked at what the psalmist is feeling. Next is ask or assert. Ask or assert. And so one thing that's good to notice is when David just asks something in his psalm, to notice what it is he asks. And this is startling to me. Here in verse 4, keep in mind that he has this army coming against him. He's feeling all of this stress. He feels overwhelmed. He feels fear. He feels out of control, feels helpless. Verse 4 says, one thing I've asked from the Lord, that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. And so he asked God for one thing, not to relieve all of his stress, not to make his life easy. He says, God, I really need one thing. I need to see your face. And I think that is really rich. No matter where you're at, no matter what you're going through or feeling right now, the Psalms can guide us into realizing that if we just see God, if we see the goodness of God in the middle of our circumstances, we're going to do well. So A is ask or assert, and I just want to spend 1 minute on the assert part. This is to walk through the psalm and to say, what are the truth statements that the psalmist makes? What does he assert as being true? And again, if you're taking notes, I would encourage you just to write this down and go back through the psalm yourself. But he asserts that God is his light, that God is his salvation. Both of those are verse 1. that the Lord is the stronghold of my life. Now, if you know any ancient Jewish history, you've probably recognized the name Masada. But Masada was a fortress on the top of a hill, so it was well defended against the Roman soldiers that besieged it. And it's a famous place in Jewish history. But when you see that word stronghold, realize that it is referring to an elevated fortress, a stronghold. And so this is interesting that David says, God, the Lord, is the stronghold of my life. Life is chaotic, but there is a place I can go. So he asserts all of that is in verse 1. And then I want you to notice that he says in verse 5, he will hide me in his shelter. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. In different Psalms, David refers to the secret place of God's presence or his secret tent. And so the theology behind this is that God is in control of all things and he offers special protection for his people. And that doesn't mean we're not going to get sick from the coronavirus or never go through difficulties. We will. But there is a place we can turn to. We can run to God in the middle of our trouble. And David refers to God having a special place for him. So he also says that God has beauty. That's in verse 4. He says that God is a teacher in verse 11. And he says that God is good in verse 13. So asking that question, what does David assert is truth, combines our experience, our feelings, with what is true about God and about life. And so that is what is so great about the Psalms. They give us a language of the heart where we get to vent our honest emotions to God and yet be reminded of truth. The last two parts of the acronym, the Psalm acronym, are L and M. What does this say about the Lord? That's the L. And we've covered a lot of different things. I would tweak that question just a little bit and say, what does this say about the Lord to you? So to me, this tells me that God is much more intimate, much more involved with my life, much more accessible than I think. And so that's really helpful to me. Even today, this psalm is profoundly encouraging to me. And then the M, what does this psalm say about me? And so what this says about me is I have a small view of God and I do not turn to him enough in the middle of my emotions and struggle. So I hope that this is encouraging to you. This psalm, as all the psalms do, invite me to talk very honestly, to engage in a brutal honesty with the God that is the stronghold of my life, the stronghold of our lives, who cares about us deeply. So I hope this is encouraging to you guys. This season of life can be one where we can go deep with God. And I hope Psalm 3 from yesterday and Psalm 27 today helps you down that path. All right, that's all I got for you guys tonight. Many of us, we have a growing number of people that are observing the Sabbath, which is a great time to just slow our lives down. So I am making a turkey and cooking dinner for our family. We're going to Skype with some friends, and then we are going to turn off uh, all electronics, and we're going to disconnect from the world for about 24 hours. And I just want to encourage you guys with this. It is so helpful to just disconnect. And so these things, going deep with God and observing a Sabbath, we invite you to it. And we'll see you again on Sunday morning, 10:15 Facebook Live. All right. See you guys.